11 months after my father died, my mother signed a document called a covenant of full surrender, transferring the deed to her paid-off house and roughly $410,000 in retirement savings to an organization called the Radiant Path Fellowship, a group I had, until that exact moment, believed was simply my mother's new, somewhat intense grief support community. I found out about the transfer 4 months after she'd already signed it, when a property records alert I'd set up years earlier, back when I helped my parents refinance their mortgage, flagged a new deed filing on their address. By the time I drove the 6 hours from Sacramento to my mother's home outside Bend, Oregon, to ask her directly what was happening, she wouldn't fully answer my questions, wouldn't let me speak with anyone at the fellowship directly, and told me, in a flat, oddly rehearsed tone I had never once heard from her in 43 years of being her daughter, that I needed to work on releasing my attachment to material concerns before I could truly understand her decision. It took me 8 months, an exit counselor who specializes in high-control group recovery, a forensic psychologist, and a civil undue influence lawsuit to get my mother, and everything she'd signed away, back. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, and, in today's story, a war waged not by another family member, but by an organization that specifically, deliberately targeted a grieving widow at the exact moment she was least equipped to protect herself. Today's story is called The Church That Inherited My Mother. Let's begin. My name is Sarah Kowalczyk. I'm 43 years old. I work as an occupational therapist in Sacramento, and my mother, Diane Kowalczyk, is 68 years old, a retired hospital pharmacist who spent 34 years working at a regional medical center in Bend, Oregon, before retiring, alongside my father, 6 years ago to enjoy what both of them had always described as a well-earned, comfortable retirement together. My father, Peter Kowalczyk, died 18 months ago of a sudden, catastrophic stroke at the age of 70, a death that arrived with almost no warning after what had been, until that point, a genuinely healthy, active retirement, a loss that devastated my mother in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, given how, in my own experience of my parents' 41-year marriage, they had always struck me as a stable, loving but not unusually dependent couple, each maintaining their own strong friendships and interests alongside their shared life together. I want to be honest in describing my mother, that she is not, by nature, a naive or easily manipulated woman. She spent over 3 decades as a hospital pharmacist, a career requiring exactly the kind of careful, evidence-based, skeptical thinking that makes what eventually happened to her genuinely difficult to reconcile with the woman I'd always known her to be. Understanding that specific tension, a sharp, professionally trained, skeptical woman, gradually drawn into what would eventually be formally assessed as a psychologically coercive, high-control religious organization, matters enormously to understanding this entire story, because it illustrates something important about how grief, at its most acute and disorienting, can genuinely override even a lifetime of otherwise sound judgment. My mother, roughly 2 months after my father's death, still deep in the raw, disorienting early stages of grief, began attending what she initially described to me as a grief and spiritual healing circle, meeting weekly at a community space in Bend, connected to an organization called the Radiant Path Fellowship, a group I understood, from my mother's early, brief descriptions, as a loosely spiritual, non-denominational community offering grief support alongside broader teachings about mindfulness, purpose, and what she described during one of our early phone calls as learning to release attachment to the things that keep us trapped in suffering. I want to be honest that I did not, in those first several months, register any particular alarm about this new community in my mother's life. Grief support groups, spiritual communities, mindfulness-oriented practices. None of these on their own struck me as concerning, and I genuinely, at the time, felt some relief that my mother had found a community offering her comfort and structure during what was, understandably, an extremely difficult period following my father's sudden death. The changes, when I look back on them now with the benefit of full hindsight, began gradually enough that I don't think any single moment would have, on its own, triggered serious alarm. My mother's language during our regular phone calls began shifting subtly, incorporating specific phrases and concepts, releasing attachment, the illusion of material security. True abundance comes from surrender, not accumulation. That felt, increasingly, disconnected from the practical, grounded way she had always spoken throughout my entire life. Around the 5-month mark following my father's death, my mother mentioned, during one call, that she'd begun attending fellowship gatherings considerably more frequently than the original weekly grief support meetings. Several evenings a week, she explained, alongside what she described as an intensive weekend retreat she'd recently attended at the organization's larger campus, roughly 90 minutes outside Bend. By the 7-month mark, my mother's participation in her prior, long-time relationships and activities, a bridge club she'd belonged to for over 15 years, regular lunches with 2 close friends from her hospital pharmacy career. Even notably, her regular calls with me had noticeably, measurably decreased, replaced, increasingly, by an expanding, all-consuming involvement with the fellowship's activities and teachings. I raised this pattern, gently, during a phone call around this time, asking my mother whether she felt like she'd been spending less time with her longtime friends lately. I think I'm just recognizing which relationships were actually serving my growth and which ones were keeping me stuck in old patterns, she told me, in that same increasingly unfamiliar, faintly rehearsed language I'd begun noticing over the preceding months. The fellowship community understands what I'm actually going through in a way that some of my old friendships just don't have the capacity for anymore. I want to describe, honestly, how difficult it was, in that specific moment, and in the months that followed, to determine whether what I was hearing reflected a genuine, if somewhat unconventional, personal evolution my mother was entitled to pursue as an autonomous adult processing profound grief in her own way, or whether it reflected something considerably more concerning. A pattern of language and reasoning that felt, increasingly, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Absorbed and repeated rather than genuinely, independently arrived at. I called my mother's closest longtime friend, a woman named Carol Fenton, who I'd known myself since childhood, asking whether she'd noticed anything similar in her own recent interactions with my mother. She canceled our last 3 lunch dates, Carol told me. The last time we did talk, she spent almost the entire conversation trying to convince me to attend a fellowship information session with her. I love your mother, Sarah, but I'll be honest, the last few conversations we've had have felt like talking to someone reciting a script rather than talking to Diane. I want to describe the specific, almost accidental way I discovered the actual scope of what had happened, because it illustrates something important about how these situations can progress well past a critical point before family members, outside the situation, gain any concrete, verifiable evidence of what's actually occurring. Roughly a year before my father's death, I had helped my parents through a mortgage refinancing process on their Bend home, and in the course of that process, had set up a county property records monitoring alert, a simple, free service several counties offer, notifying a registered email address whenever any new document affecting a specific property is filed with the county recorder's office, a service I'd set up largely out of ordinary financial diligence and had honestly, mostly forgotten about in the years since. That alert notified me, roughly 11 months after my father's death, of a new deed filing on my parents', now solely my mother's, Bend property. A notification I initially assumed might reflect some routine administrative matter, until I actually pulled the recorded document and found a full, formal transfer of the property's deed from my mother's name to an entity called Radiant Path Fellowship Ministries, a nonprofit religious organization registered in Oregon. I sat with that document for a long time, feeling a specific, mounting horror I want to describe honestly, because I think it's important for anyone watching this to understand exactly how disorienting it is to discover, through a routine administrative alert, rather than through any direct communication from your own parent, that she has transferred her entire home to a religious organization you'd understood, until that exact moment, to be simply a grief support community she'd found comfort in. I drove the 6 hours from Sacramento to Bend the following weekend, arriving unannounced, uncertain, going into that drive, exactly how to approach a conversation this significant and this potentially explosive. My mother's reaction, when I directly raised the deed transfer, confirmed, immediately and with real alarm, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an incomplete picture on my part. "I made a decision about my own property, Sarah," she told me, her tone carrying a specific, careful evenness that felt, to me, considerably more concerning than open defensiveness would have. "I understand it's a significant decision, but it's mine to make, and I need you to trust that I've thought about it carefully and with clear intention." "Mom, that's the house you and Dad lived in for over 30 years, I said, my own voice considerably less controlled. "That's your entire retirement security. Can you at least explain to me why you did this, in your own words, without the fellowship's specific language attached to it?" "You're demonstrating exactly the kind of attachment to material security that the fellowship's teachings are helping me move beyond," she said. "I understand this is difficult for you to accept, Sarah, but I need you to work on releasing your own attachment to what you think my life should look like, rather than trying to control decisions that are genuinely mine to make." I want to describe how specifically, deliberately disorienting that response felt. Not an angry, defensive reaction I might have expected and known how to navigate, but a calm, almost clinical reframing of my own genuine, love-driven concern as itself, a kind of psychological failing on my part. A pattern I would later learn, through my own research and through working with an exit counselor, is an extremely common and deliberate rhetorical technique used by high-control groups, specifically to deflect and delegitimize exactly the kind of outside concern that might otherwise threaten a member's continued involvement and compliance. I began researching the Radiant Path Fellowship extensively in the weeks following that difficult, unsuccessful confrontation, uncertain, at that point, whether I was dealing with a genuinely unconventional, but ultimately benign spiritual community my mother had every right to join, however uncomfortable I personally found her involvement, or something considerably more concerning. What I found, across a combination of online research, former member testimonial forums, and eventually, formal legal and journalistic records, painted an increasingly alarming picture. Radiant Path Fellowship, founded roughly 15 years earlier by a man who styled himself as Teacher Aurelio, had a documented history, across multiple former member accounts I located, of specifically targeting individuals during periods of acute grief or crisis, recently widowed spouses, people navigating significant health diagnoses, individuals recently divorced, through grief support and crisis outreach programming that functioned. According to numerous consistent former member accounts, as an intentional recruitment pipeline into the organization's considerably more intensive, isolating, and financially demanding inner practices. I found, through a combination of Oregon nonprofit filing records and investigative journalism from a regional newspaper that had published a multi-part series on the organization roughly 4 years earlier. Documentation that Radiant Path Fellowship had received across its 15-year operating history, property and financial transfers from at least 6 other members that individual former member accounts described as occurring during periods of acute personal crisis, transfers that, in at least 2 documented cases, had subsequently become the subject of formal legal disputes brought by the members' families. This research, while genuinely alarming, also gave me my first concrete, actionable path forward, connecting me, through one of the former member forums, to a network of exit counselors and family advocates who specialized specifically in helping families navigate exactly this category of situation. I retained an exit counselor, a former social worker turned specialized consultant named Miriam Castellano, who had spent nearly 2 decades working specifically with families navigating high-control group involvement. A field, she explained during our first consultation, that requires a genuinely distinct combination of psychological, legal, and practical expertise beyond what a general therapist or family attorney typically possesses. I want to walk you through the specific pattern I'm seeing in what you've described, because understanding the mechanism is going to matter enormously to how we approach helping your mother, Miriam told me during our first extended consultation. Grief-driven recruitment into a high-control group typically follows a recognizable arc. Initial outreach specifically timed to a moment of acute vulnerability, gradual escalation of time and emotional investment in the group, systematic erosion of outside relationships and support systems that might otherwise provide a reality check, introduction of increasingly specific language and reasoning frameworks that gradually replace the person's own prior, independent way of thinking and speaking, and eventually, once sufficient psychological investment and isolation have been established, requests for increasingly significant financial or material commitment, framed specifically as spiritual growth or transcendence rather than what it actually, functionally is. I asked Miriam whether my mother's specific, professional background as a hospital pharmacist, a career built on exactly the kind of skeptical, evidence-based thinking that seemed, on its face, like it should have provided some meaningful protection against this kind of manipulation, made her situation unusual or particularly concerning. Actually, in my professional experience, it's a common and important misconception that intelligence or professional skepticism provides meaningful protection against this kind of manipulation, Miriam said. These techniques don't primarily target a person's intellectual capacity for critical thinking. They target the specific, acute emotional vulnerability of grief, isolation, and identity disruption, which can genuinely bypass or override even a lifetime of otherwise sound, skeptical judgment. Your mother's professional background doesn't mean this couldn't happen to her. If anything, groups like this specifically deliberately target capable, previously well-functioning individuals during acute crisis, precisely because those individuals' eventual full, restored financial and social resources, once fully recruited, make them more valuable long-term members than someone with fewer resources to eventually extract. Alongside Miriam's psychological and family navigation guidance, I retained an attorney, David Ferris, who specialized specifically in undue influence and elder financial exploitation cases, to explore what formal legal options existed for challenging the property and retirement account transfers my mother had already completed. David explained that Oregon law, like most states, recognizes a formal legal claim of undue influence, distinct from claims of outright fraud, applicable to situations where a person's free will and independent judgment have been substantially overcome by another party's systematic psychological manipulation, even in the absence of any single, identifiable moment of coercion or deception. A legal framework, David explained, particularly well-suited to exactly the kind of gradual, cumulative psychological pattern high-control group involvement typically produces. The challenge in a case like this, David told me during our initial consultation, is that your mother at the time she executed these transfers was, by every available legal standard, a competent adult, capable of understanding the nature and consequences of what she was signing. This isn't a capacity case, the way it might be if we were dealing with dementia or another form of diminished cognitive function. This is a case that requires demonstrating, through expert psychological testimony and a detailed, documented pattern of the organization's specific tactics, that her free will was substantially overcome through systematic, deliberate manipulation. A case that's winnable, and that courts do recognize, but that requires considerably more sophisticated evidentiary work than a straightforward capacity or forgery case would. David also flagged something significant regarding the specific timing and circumstances of the transfers. Oregon law, he explained, provides heightened scrutiny for transfers made by an individual during a documented period of acute grief or bereavement to any organization or individual with whom the person developed a relationship, specifically during that same bereavement period. A legal provision, David noted, that had been strengthened in recent years, specifically in response to a documented pattern of exactly this kind of grief-targeted financial exploitation. Providing a meaningfully favorable legal framework for our case, provided we could assemble sufficient evidence of the fellowship's specific, documented pattern of targeting grieving individuals. Building the actual case, over the following several months, required assembling several distinct categories of evidence, working in close coordination between Miriam's psychological expertise, David's legal strategy, and my own ongoing, difficult efforts to maintain whatever limited relationship and communication with my mother remained possible throughout this process. Miriam facilitated an independent psychological evaluation of my mother, conducted by a forensic psychologist, Dr. Patricia Wusu, who specialized specifically in assessing undue influence and coercive control in the context of high-control group involvement. An evaluation that required, given my mother's own continued resistance to acknowledging any concern about her situation, a carefully constructed approach, ultimately achieved by framing the evaluation with Miriam's guidance as connected to a broader, unrelated family estate planning matter rather than directly challenging my mother's involvement with the fellowship. An approach Miriam explained was necessary given how directly confrontational approaches typically trigger defensive entrenchment rather than openness in individuals experiencing exactly this pattern of psychological investment. Dr. Wusu's evaluation, conducted over 2 sessions, documented a pattern of psychological indicators strongly consistent with coercive control and undue influence, including notably restricted, repetitive language patterns closely mirroring documented fellowship teaching materials. Miriam had separately obtained significant difficulty engaging with hypothetical questions that invited independent, critical evaluation of the fellowship's teachings or leadership, and a documented pattern of what Dr. Wusu's report characterized as thought-terminating clichés, specific, repeated phrases used consistently to shut down further inquiry or reflection whenever a conversation approached genuinely difficult or challenging territory regarding the fellowship or its founder. David's investigation, working alongside a private investigator, separately assembled documentation of the fellowship's broader pattern, the prior legal disputes involving other former members' property transfers, financial records suggesting teacher Aurelio himself maintained a considerably more lavish personal lifestyle than the organization's stated nonprofit communal mission would suggest, and critically, internal fellowship training materials, obtained through a former member willing to cooperate with our investigation, that explicitly, systematically outlined recruitment and retention strategies specifically targeting grieving, recently bereaved individuals. I want to introduce a specific person whose cooperation became genuinely central to building our case. A woman named Catherine Voss, a former fellowship member who had, roughly 3 years earlier, successfully exited the organization with the help of her own family and an exit counselor, and whom Miriam connected me with once our investigation had progressed far enough to benefit from a genuine, first-hand insider account. Catherine's own experience, once she shared it with me over the course of several long, difficult conversations, mirrored my mother's situation with a specific, painful precision. Catherine had joined the fellowship following her own husband's death, had similarly transferred significant assets to the organization during her period of most acute grief and psychological vulnerability, and had ultimately been extracted from the organization only through her adult children's sustained, patient, professionally guided intervention over nearly a year. "The single most important thing I can tell you," Catherine told me during one of our early conversations, "is that direct confrontation, telling someone bluntly that they're in a cult and demanding they leave immediately, almost never works, and often backfires badly, deepening the person's entrenchment rather than opening any path toward reconsideration. What actually worked, in my own case, was my daughter maintaining consistent, patient, non-judgmental contact, never fully agreeing with my involvement but never cutting me off either, slowly, patiently planting small seeds of doubt and independent thinking over months, until I eventually had enough psychological space to start questioning things myself, rather than feeling like I was being forced to choose between the fellowship and my own family in some kind of ultimatum." Catherine's account, and her ongoing willingness to speak directly with my mother, once enough trust and legal groundwork had been established, ultimately became one of the single most valuable resources in this entire ordeal. A person my mother could not as easily dismiss as an outside skeptic who didn't understand, given Catherine's own genuine, first-hand experience within the exact same organization. Following Miriam's guidance, and informed directly by Catherine's own hard-won experience, I shifted my approach with my mother, over the following several months, away from direct confrontation about the property transfer, and toward a considerably slower, more patient strategy of maintaining consistent, warm, non-judgmental contact, continuing regular calls and visits without directly relitigating the deed transfer or the fellowship in every single conversation. Instead, focusing on simply remaining a consistent, loving, present daughter my mother could continue to trust and rely on, even while she remained, for the time being, deeply embedded in the organization. I want to describe how genuinely difficult this approach was to sustain, emotionally, throughout this period. The specific, exhausting discipline of biting back the urgent, powerful instinct to argue, to plead, to directly confront my mother about a situation I understood, with mounting evidence and expert guidance, to be genuinely harmful in favor of a slower, more patient strategy that Miriam and Catherine both consistently assured me was considerably more likely to actually succeed over time. Roughly 5 months into this patient approach, small, gradual signs of independent questioning began to emerge in my mother's own conversation, unprompted by any direct confrontation on my part. She mentioned, during one call, some mild, passing frustration about a recent fellowship leadership decision she found harder to understand than usual. She asked me, during another call, a genuinely curious, independent question about my own life and work that felt, for the first time in many months, disconnected from any fellowship-related framing or language. "I think I miss just talking about ordinary things sometimes," she told me during that call, in a tone that struck me immediately as considerably more like the mother I remembered than anything I'd heard from her in well over a year. The genuine turning point, according to my mother's own later account of this period, occurred during a fellowship retreat roughly 7 months into our sustained approach, when my mother witnessed an incident involving another member, a woman, similarly recently widowed, being pressured, during an intensive group session, to transfer additional retirement funds to the organization despite visible, evident distress and hesitation, a scene my mother described. Once she finally felt safe enough to discuss it openly with me, as producing her own first genuinely independent moment of doubt about the organization's true nature and priorities. "I kept thinking about you," my mother told me, months later, once she'd fully processed and begun articulating her own experience of this turning point. "Watching that woman being pressured, I suddenly thought about what it would have looked like if someone had been watching me. The same way, during my own most difficult moments after your father died. I think some part of me had known, for a while, that something wasn't right, but I hadn't let myself really look at it directly until I saw it happening to someone else." My mother began, in the weeks following that retreat, gradually reducing her fellowship involvement, a process Miriam had prepared me to expect would likely be nonlinear and difficult. Several steps of genuine, hopeful progress followed, at various points, by renewed periods of doubt and re-engagement with the organization, as the psychological process of disentangling from months of deep, sustained investment rarely follows a clean, single, decisive break. My mother fully exited Radiant Path Fellowship roughly 10 months after our initial, difficult confrontation in her kitchen, a process that Miriam supported through what she described as a structured, gradual exit protocol, including, critically, connecting my mother directly with Catherine and several other former members for ongoing, peer-based support specifically designed to help her navigate the genuinely difficult psychological process of rebuilding an independent identity and worldview after such a significant, sustained period of embedded involvement. Once fully separated from the organization, my mother worked with David to formally pursue legal recovery of the transferred property and retirement funds, filing a civil undue influence claim against Radiant Path Fellowship Ministries, supported by Dr. Wusu's psychological evaluation, Catherine's corroborating testimony about the organization's broader documented pattern, and the internal training materials David's investigation had obtained. The fellowship's own attorneys initially contested the claim vigorously, arguing, much as Anthony had in an earlier story on this channel, that my mother's transfers reflected her own genuine, voluntary spiritual conviction rather than any form of coercion or undue influence, and that the organization's grief support programming reflected legitimate, sincere ministry rather than any deliberate exploitation. This defense became considerably harder to sustain once David's investigation, through continued discovery, obtained additional internal fellowship communications explicitly discussing my mother's specific financial situation and retirement assets in detail well before she had, according to her own account, made any independent decision to transfer them. Communications suggesting a level of deliberate, calculated financial targeting that went well beyond any genuine, incidental spiritual counseling relationship. Rather than proceed to a full civil trial, Radiant Path Fellowship's attorneys, once confronted with the full scope of evidence David's investigation had assembled, requested mediation, ultimately reaching a settlement that returned the full deed to my mother's Bend property, along with a substantial majority of the transferred retirement funds, structured through a negotiated repayment arrangement reflecting the portion of funds the organization could document as already having been spent on legitimate, verifiable operating expenses in the intervening period. As part of the broader settlement, the fellowship also agreed to specific, court-monitored changes to its grief support and outreach programming, including mandatory disclosure requirements regarding any financial solicitation directed at members within a defined bereavement period, and independent, third-party monitoring of the organization's practices for a period of 3 years. Provisions David and Miriam both characterized as a genuinely meaningful, if imperfect, structural safeguard. Given how difficult it typically proves to achieve any broader, systemic accountability for organizations operating in the specific, legally complicated space between genuine religious practice and documented financial exploitation. I want to describe, honestly, what my mother's ongoing recovery has looked like in the roughly 18 months since her formal exit from the fellowship, because I think the specific, difficult, nonlinear texture of that recovery matters considerably more than the cleaner, more resolved narrative a simple legal victory might suggest. My mother has struggled, throughout this period, with a specific, complicated combination of grief for my father, which the fellowship's intervention had, in a genuine sense, interrupted and complicated rather than actually helped her process, and a separate, additional grief about the roughly 18 months of her life the organization had consumed, months she describes, now, with real pain, as feeling like a kind of extended fog she's still working. With an ongoing therapist specializing in high-control group recovery to fully process and integrate. I lost almost 2 years I can't get back, she told me, during a particularly difficult, honest conversation roughly a year after her exit. Not just the money, though I'm grateful beyond words to have that back. 2 years of actually, fully grieving your father the way I needed to. 2 years of my real friendships with Carol and everyone else. 2 years of just being myself instead of reciting language that wasn't even really mine. I've tried, throughout this ongoing recovery process, to hold space for exactly that grief, without rushing my mother toward some falsely tidy resolution, understanding, through Miriam's ongoing guidance, that genuine recovery from this kind of sustained psychological manipulation typically requires considerably more time and patience than the legal resolution itself, however meaningful that legal victory genuinely was. I want to spend some time on the man at the center of Radiant Path Fellowship, because understanding, as much as the available evidence allows, who he actually was and how he built this organization adds important context to this entire story. David's investigation, once it expanded beyond the specific question of my mother's transfers into the organization's broader financial structure, revealed that Teacher Aurelio, a name that turned out, unsurprisingly, to be an adopted persona rather than the man's legal identity, which David's investigator determined to be Gerald Whitmore. A former multi-level marketing executive with a documented history of 2 prior failed business ventures before founding Radiant Path Fellowship roughly 15 years earlier, maintained a personal lifestyle considerably more lavish than the organization's stated nonprofit communal mission would suggest, including a private residence on the fellowship's main campus, valued at over $1.2 million, a collection of vehicles registered under a personal holding company, and a pattern of international travel that internal financial records characterized as leadership development retreats, but that David's investigation found no corresponding evidence of any actual organizational programming connected to. I want to be careful, in describing this, not to suggest that every person involved in leading or facilitating fellowship programming was necessarily a knowing, deliberate participant in what amounted, functionally, to a sustained financial exploitation scheme. Miriam explained to me, during one of our later conversations that organizations like this typically operate through a layered structure in which many facilitators and lower-level leaders genuinely, sincerely believe in the organization's stated spiritual mission, having themselves been recruited and gradually invested through the same psychological process my mother experienced, while a considerably smaller inner circle, centered around the organization's founder, maintains full knowing awareness of the financial exploitation underlying the broader structure. This is part of what makes these organizations so difficult to fully dismantle, legally and practically, Miriam told me. Most of the people your mother interacted with regularly, the facilitators who led her grief support sessions, the other members she formed genuine friendships with, were very likely sincere, well-intentioned people who had themselves been drawn in through exactly the same process, genuinely believing in the mission they were promoting. The exploitation is real and devastating, but it's rarely as simple as a single, obviously villainous figure consciously deceiving everyone around him. It's usually a more complicated structure, in which genuine belief and calculated exploitation coexist at different levels of the same organization. Once our civil case against Radiant Path Fellowship became a matter of public record, and following a follow-up piece the regional newspaper that had originally investigated the organization published covering our settlement, I began receiving messages from several other families who had experienced similar situations with the fellowship, or with similar organizations elsewhere, seeking guidance based on our own family's experience. One family, the Hendersons, whose own mother had been involved with the fellowship roughly 6 years before my own mother, described an experience that had ended considerably less successfully than ours. Their mother had remained fully embedded in the organization, having transferred nearly her entire retirement savings roughly 4 years earlier. And despite the family's repeated efforts at both direct confrontation and, later, once they learned of it, the more patient approach Miriam had guided me toward, remained, as of our conversation, still fully involved and unwilling to reconsider her situation. I think the timing of when you get help matters enormously, the Henderson daughter, a woman named Patricia, told me during a long, difficult conversation. We didn't know about exit counseling as a specialized field until nearly 3 years into my mother's involvement. By that point, the psychological investment was so deep that even Miriam, once we finally connected with her, told us honestly that our chances of success were considerably lower than they would have been if we'd started this patient, professional approach earlier. I connected Patricia's family with Catherine, hopping the same kind of peer-based, first-hand former member connection that had proven so valuable in my own mother's eventual exit, might offer some additional path forward for the Hendersons. Though I want to be honest that, as of the recording of this video, their situation remains unresolved. A sobering reminder that not every family navigating this kind of ordeal reaches the relatively hopeful resolution my own family was ultimately able to achieve. I've come to understand, through these connections with other affected families, that our own family's outcome, while genuinely meaningful and hard-won, also reflected a considerable amount of good fortune in the specific timing of our discovery and intervention. A sobering, humbling recognition that has shaped how carefully I try to communicate this story's broader lessons. Resisting any temptation to suggest that the specific approach that worked for my mother represents a guaranteed formula rather than one genuinely helpful, evidence-based path that happened to succeed in our particular circumstances. I want to return to something Dr. Patricia Wusu, the forensic psychologist, explained to me during one of our later conversations, because I think it offers genuinely important, broadly applicable context beyond just the specific circumstances of high-control religious groups. I want you to understand something about the specific window of vulnerability that acute grief creates, Dr. Wusu told me. In the weeks and months following a significant, sudden loss, the human brain is, quite literally, functioning differently than it does under ordinary circumstances. Decision-making capacity, risk assessment, and the ability to maintain healthy skepticism toward new relationships and communities are all measurably, documentably affected by acute grief, even in individuals with no underlying cognitive impairment whatsoever. This isn't a character flaw or a failure of intelligence. It's a genuine, temporary neurological and psychological state that predatory individuals and organizations have learned, whether through deliberate study or simply accumulated practical experience, to specifically and systematically target. I asked Dr. Wusu what specific, practical protections families might build in during exactly this kind of acute grief window, informed by everything her professional experience had taught her about this pattern. I generally recommend, she said, that families of someone navigating acute, recent grief maintain somewhat closer than usual involvement in any major financial or legal decisions during roughly the first 2 years following a significant loss. Not in a controlling, infantilizing way, but simply as an additional, trusted check, someone the grieving person has explicitly agreed, ideally before the crisis even occurs, to consult before making any major, irreversible financial commitment during that specific window. I also recommend genuine caution, not blanket rejection, but genuine, informed caution toward any new relationship or community that develops rapidly during this period, and that specifically gradually begins requesting significant time, emotional investment, or financial commitment. That pattern on its own doesn't prove predatory intent. But it's exactly the pattern predatory individuals and organizations reliably follow, and healthy, legitimate relationships and communities typically don't require anywhere near that same pace or scale of commitment during someone's most acutely vulnerable period. That guidance, build in a trusted check for major decisions during acute grief, and maintain genuine, informed caution toward rapidly escalating new relationships during that same window, has become, for me, one of the most broadly useful practical lessons to emerge from this entire ordeal, something I now share, consistently, with anyone in my own life navigating a significant recent loss. I want to close with a smaller, more personal detail. What happened with Carol Fenton, my mother's longtime bridge club friend, whose own early observation, talking to someone reciting a script rather than talking to Deanne, had been one of the first, earliest confirmations that something genuinely concerning was happening. Carol never fully stepped away from my mother, throughout the entire 18-month ordeal, even during the many months when my mother had all but stopped returning her calls, and had, on more than one occasion, according to Carol's own account, responded to Carol's gentle attempts at continued contact with the same flat, faintly rehearsed dismissiveness I'd experienced myself. Carol kept sending the occasional card, kept leaving the occasional voicemail, kept, quietly and patiently, holding a space in her own life for the friend she hoped, without any guarantee, would eventually find her way back. I wasn't going to be the friend who gave up, Carol told me, once my mother had fully exited the fellowship and the two of them had finally, gradually begun rebuilding their 15-year friendship. I didn't know if it would ever work. I just knew I'd rather keep trying and be wrong than give up and always wonder if my continuing to reach out might have made some small difference. My mother and Carol resumed their weekly bridge club roughly a year after my mother's formal exit, and I want to describe the specific, quiet significance of watching that particular ordinary routine return. Two old friends, back at the same card table they'd shared for over 15 years. My mother laughing at some small joke Carol made, in a way that felt, watching it from the doorway of Carol's living room during a visit roughly a year and a half after everything began. Like witnessing the genuine, hard-won return of the actual, complete person the fellowship had, for a difficult stretch of time, very nearly taken away from all of us. That bridge table, more than any settlement figure or legal victory, has become, for me, the clearest, most meaningful marker of what this entire fight was actually for. For every family watching someone love disappear into something they don't understand. If you're watching this and someone you love, a parent, a sibling, anyone navigating acute grief, crisis, or significant life disruption, has become involved with a group, community, or relationship that has produced changes you find genuinely concerning, unfamiliar language, withdrawal from long-time relationships, increasing secrecy or defensiveness about their involvement, or, most seriously, requests for significant financial or material commitment, I want to say something directly to you. Direct confrontation, however understandable and however urgently you may feel the need for it, very often backfires, deepening entrenchment rather than opening any genuine path toward reconsideration. The patient, sustained, non-judgmental approach Miriam guided me toward, and that Catherine's own hard-won experience confirmed, is considerably more likely to actually succeed, even though it requires an exhausting, difficult discipline that runs directly against every urgent instinct you'll likely feel in the moment. Seek out professional guidance specifically trained in this exact category of situation, an exit counselor with genuine expertise in high-control group dynamics, an attorney specializing in undue influence claims, rather than attempting to navigate this entirely on your own instincts, however well-intentioned. This is a genuinely specialized field, with real, hard-won expertise about what actually works. Developed by people who have guided many families through exactly this kind of difficult, patient process before. And if you do successfully help someone you love find their way out, understand that their recovery will likely take considerably longer and follow a considerably less linear path than the moment of formal exit itself might suggest. My mother is home again, in every sense that matters. But the 2 years the fellowship took from her, and from us, remain a genuine, ongoing loss we're both still learning how to fully grieve and integrate, even now, well past the legal resolution that formally returned what had been taken. My name is Sarah Kowalczyk, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of someone you love who's become involved in something that concerns you, don't wait to seek guidance. Reach out to a specialized resource today. And tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.